Welcome to Myth Informed. I'm your host, Brian Edward. And along with me, we have Melissa Chen. Melissa is recently hosted or interviewed and played parts on COVID Con. She is works with the foundation with Beyond or Ideas Beyond Borders. Sorry,
Yeah.
and is a founding member where she does an enormous amount of, like, I would say, humanist work, but I really consider her part of the intellectual dark web. Melissa is extremely smart, part of what I would call is just a think tank in America. And a lot of times when you want to get a centered position, a nuanced position, check Melissa Chen's opinion on things, and you'll get that. Did I describe you well? I mean, is that right? Do you feel like you try to look at all sides of the issue and not be a partisan, to always check yourself?
Yeah, it's so easy to fall into tribal lines. And one of the things that I find really interesting about the pandemic is that the ideological priors that you have can be confirmed by this pandemic in almost any way, right? So if you have been for socialized medicine for a long time, this kind of confirms it. But then on the other hand, if you've been conservative on some issues, then this kind of favors conservative immigration policies. And if you're a libertarian, you would want to abolish regulations like the FDA and the CDC's regulation for testing companies or occupational licensing. You want to fast track all these doctors to be able to practice as quick as possible. So it kind of lays bare the tribal lines that we've had in America, because you see this flip, right? At the beginning, when this pandemic was just kind of brewing just in Wuhan in China, you had the Democrats and sort of leftist leaders saying, "Oh, don't worry, let's come out in defiance of this virus. Let's not let xenophobia take over us. Travel bans are bad," because this was confirming their ideological biases. And then the conservatives were kind of the other way around. They were like, no, we should shut down travel from China. And then when, fast forward 1 month later, when it was pretty clear that this was coming onto our shores, the script was flipped. You had, the Democrats saw that they could pounce on this issue as something that Trump wasn't early on and could pin him to it. So all of a sudden, they started hounding on this issue. And this is a failure, when there's a total failure of government, because they realized that this was something that confirmed that could promote their narrative. And likewise, a lot of Republicans were doing the same. The conservatives were suddenly all of a sudden saying, wait, no, this is not that big of an issue, when before, they could have used this in terms of cementing their policy preferences, especially the populist conservatives.
No, it's a good point. And you're right. It does confirm that, because as a libertarian myself, I do kind of point at the FDA and a little bit of the CDC and failure to get testing out, as well as there's so many FDA rules. Like, for example, in ophthalmology, there's lots of drugs where they want combined drugs, where you could combine a steroid with a anesthetic. But companies won't produce them because it's so expensive to get a double drug through the FDA. So right. They say, no, we were going to give you two different things. You're going to have to use two different medicines and administer both of them, which makes it harder for patients and harder for, So again, but that's my biases. But there's certain things I think, that they are probably doing right that, I'm missing because my own bias plays in.
Yeah, I mean, like another good example of this is, the FDA not certifying N95 masks. These are N95 masks are the gold standard. They're like the champagne, it's like the gold standard of all sparkling wines, right? So N95s were the creme de la creme. But by the FDA not certifying N95s for use in our hospitals, this cheaper alternative was not like we had trouble trying to import these, and in a situation where we have a severe PPE shortage, that it was like shooting ourselves in the foot with this extra nonsense.
Yeah, and like the N95s, to just put a bow on that, they they will stop any kind of aerosolized if it's in the air. So if you have somebody in a specific like airborne transmission, you have to have that. Like if you had a patient, for example, that had drug-resistant TB, you have to be in an isolation ward with an N95 mask. But for somebody with like actually Ebola, you don't need those because that's a contact droplet piece you don't need. So the N95s are huge, especially if this thing's airborne, which it might be.
Looks like it is, yeah.
Yeah. So you recently were at COVIDCon, which was the world's biggest online conference. I caught some of this. I didn't see it at the time, but you can all see this in retrospect. So if you go to COVIDCon, just sign in. All it took was an email address.
Yeah, but they'll load all the videos on YouTube, I'm sure, in the coming weeks. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't see them on YouTube, but it's really an easy site to navigate. You can just hop in and check some of these out. And I saw I'm probably screw these names up. Yang Zhenli, who is a Chinese dissident. Apparently, he was the son of a Communist Party member in China. Is now kind of pushing a counter narrative and talking about what he sees. Some of the videos that he shows were amazing. One particular one where they were filming a propaganda minister coming in. So this is pre-Xi Jinping coming into Wuhan. So instead they sent in the minister of whomever, and they were filming a video, and it looked like, the people were paying attention from the houses, waving, and some kind of almost a parade. But then you take cell phone video of the same event, and people are screaming, "It's fake, it's fake," meaning they know that this is a propaganda thing being filmed, and it's like they're trying to photobomb it, except for with words. Does that mean, are the Chinese people aware of what's going on, or is it more of like a North Korea piece where perhaps they're just ill-informed?
I mean, the control that the CCP has, the Chinese Communist Party has of almost every aspect of life is very totalitarian. So, even something like your social media channels, right? Like, so our social media companies cannot operate in China. But what they do is they put a firewall around their internet, and then they have their own social media companies or tech companies operating there. So you have Weibo, which is their search engine, WeChat, which is like their WhatsApp. And the moment you upload something very sensitive, for example, if you can't even like post a picture of Winnie the Pooh now on any Chinese social media, because there was a meme that went around likening Winnie the Pooh to Xi Jinping, the leader, and that's in a very derogatory way. And so now Winnie the Pooh became the subversive symbol, and every time that appears in some way, it gets taken out very quickly. And so they're able to control, just your average daily speech like that, and expression, in a very totalitarian way. And so that does affect how people behave. They're afraid at the same time. But on the other hand, when everything you read and encounter can be controlled, I mean, it's hard not to fault them from, for buying the party line, for buying the party narrative. If that's all that you're fed, how do you break out of that mindset?
Yeah, but it seems like so many people are actually not buying. So many Chinese citizens are not buying the party narrative. The fact that they were screaming that this is fake. Now, and I also hear if you have a VPN in China, you can get around a lot of these firewalls and have access to the outside world in a way that another country you couldn't. So is that informing like the Chinese people in a way that is hard to measure?
Well, the thing that's hard to measure is how many of them really, have question the official narrative, what they're fed, because it kind of begins when they're young and they go to school, and the education system there is very centralized, and they're taught history written by the Chinese Communist Party from the beginning, and taught that the reasons for China's failure in the last 100-year humiliation was because of the West. That essentially, since the Opium Wars and the last 100 years, the reason why China's been lagging behind is purely the result of the West. Nothing to do with Mao's policies, nothing to do with the Great Leap Forward that resulted in famine that killed so many Chinese people. There isn't a reckoning of the past. In the same way that you have here, right? And here in the West, we talk all the time about, slavery or these terrible institutions of America's checkered past. And we're able to have this conversation. But that doesn't happen in China. What they're fed is this victimhood narrative. And so people are actually, naturally primed to be angry at the West. And so when China spins this propaganda and tells the people there, this virus is actually coming out from the U.S. Army. They spun it up the CIA spun it up, and the U.S. Army kind of brought it here. They're very inclined to believe this stuff because they don't have, this tradition or culture of questioning things. They've been fed propaganda their whole lives, and that's why that is so dangerous.
Right. Now, what you're referring to there is, and I don't know why this hasn't maybe gotten more press. So a Chinese official that was connected to the government tweeted out that he thought that this virus could have been planted by the American government or the American military or the CIA,
Yes.
right? And then the Chinese government itself, like it could be an official that's gone rogue. That happens.
It's not. This is Zhao Lijian, and he's with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Interesting.
He's not rogue.
But okay, but even if you had, you would think that the Chinese government itself, Xi Jinping, could make a correction on this. Because you could have somebody kind of bark really loud and you play good cop, bad cop, but they haven't even done that.
No.
Interesting. And so I think,
it's so blatant.
That's so blatant. Why is that not being covered more? I mean, that it seems to be a footnote when that ought to be a headline.
You mean covered by the Western press, or
yes,
covered by
the Western press?
I mean, so the at least what's considered right-wing media here in the U.S., we've covered that, right? Like you do see it on Fox News a lot. You do see it on Daily Wire and all these other right-wing sources. It was eventually picked up by everybody else, but it took a while. Generally, the people like Fox and Tucker Carlson were on this beat much far ahead of the mainstream media.
Okay, so it is. So it's being covered to a degree.
To a degree.
Okay. So as far as what seems to be trending a bit right now is the defunding of the WHO. So it looks like, and we did a show on Myth Informed where I cited a lot of Jennifer Zhang's research on the timeline of this, and she makes an incredibly powerful case that China was aware, the Chinese government officials were aware of human-to-human transmission weeks before they let anyone know, or possibly even months. So, the WHO seemed to just buy the party line. They didn't investigate China. They don't respond to Taiwan, who's trying to send them messages. Was that a smart call to defund the WHO? And it seems like Bill Gates, for example, mentioned, this is the wrong time to defund the WHO, right in the middle of a pandemic. This is terrible. What are your thoughts?
So just a little bit about the mechanics of something like defunding an organization. I mentioned this before, that in the NGO world, funds are usually pre-committed. The last, the current fiscal year has already been paid for. And this announcement that Trump came out saying that he wants to defund the WHO doesn't mean that this year's funding is immediately pulled. By the way, this would also have to involve Congress if he were to do that. If he were to actually pull this year's funding from the WHO, you would have to involve Congress. But this is about not renewing the $400 million or so that American taxpayer actually fund the WHO for next fiscal year. So I don't think it actually disrupts operations this year. But on the other hand, we've had so much evidence in the past few months that the WHO has essentially become an extension of the Chinese Communist Party. You're right, it has started. If you follow the timeline, it looks particularly incriminating. About 31st of December, that is, New Year's Eve of last year, that the Taiwanese government had actually warned the WHO, hey, we are hearing about human-to-human transmission from our doctors who are talking to their mainland colleagues. And how did the mainland colleagues know? Because staff members in hospitals were starting to fall ill. That's how you know that that is the fastest sign that to detect something like human to human transmission. And instead of acting on that information, the WHO completely ignored it. But not only ignored it, but 2 weeks later, on January 14th, actually tweeted, there is no evidence for human to human transmission. The question is, why would they do something like that? And the answer is, at the time, they were trying to appease China's line to prevent the world from barring travel from China. So whilst China was barring travel out of Wuhan to the other parts of their own country, they were saying to the world, there is no need to lock down travel between your country and our country. They wanted travel to keep going on. I mean, this would also make them look bad. And the WHO, instead of pushing back, as they did 2003, they actually did a really good job with SARS. It was a different head of the WHO, it's not the current one. They locked down travel pretty quickly after SARS emerged, and issued this travel directive. And somehow, this time around, completely failed to do so. So and there was a study, I think, by the University of Southampton that said that if the world had acted 3 weeks earlier, 95% of the global spread would have been prevented.
Yeah, I saw that. I saw that one, and Jennifer's pieces talked about that as well. What is in it? Like, this is speculation. What is in it for the Chinese government? Let's say that they were aware, even in say mid-December, that in fact they had a virus on their hands with human to human transmission. Like, why try to cover it up? Like, it seems like, isn't this going to get out anyways? And what's in it for them versus, okay, let's stop travel, let's kind of lock the country down? Is that disastrous to them economically?
There's a few, forces at play. I think one thing that was definitely happening was there are different layers of government, even in within the Chinese Communist Party. You had the provincial governments, so like the local government of Wuhan, and then you have their Politburo, their federal level, right? Like the main Chinese Communist Party that is situated in Beijing. And so there is a sense of there was tension between the local governments and the federal government, actually in the same way that we kind of have it too here in the US with state governments and the federal. And so there's a good, there's some evidence that this kind of tension was happening, and the local government of Hubei province did not want to admit that something was happening in their city. So they submitted a report, I think on January 7th to the party Congress. And in that report did not say anything about what was going on. They already knew by that time that there were cases of mysterious pneumonia, but they did not alert Beijing at the time. And it's because they were afraid to look bad. And also, actually, during this time, China had a law that said that any communication about outbreaks have to be approved by the party before they can be made official. So this is another layer. So, because, when you're a totalitarian, authoritarian government, you're always concerned about legitimacy, especially outside legitimacy, credibility. And that's why China wanted so badly to be seen by the world as having, their government be legitimate. And there's nothing that pokes at your legitimacy more than having your reputation completely assailed because you bungled this response, because you didn't act early. So it's better to sweep it under the rug. I think at the time, frankly, they also had no idea how bad this was going to be. Their instinct is to just hope it, just close your eyes and just hope it goes away.
And because it's like a top-down institution, do you get some of the mistakes that, say, a repressive like Stalinist regime would have, where every person is overinflating their production numbers on everything, so you end up with a famine because they think they have more food than they actually do coming from the communist farms? And was it the same thing with China, that every single governor and province head is underreporting what's going on? No, that's not a problem here.
Oh yeah, for sure. And so are clearly the federal numbers, like the actual numbers that they are submitting to the WHO. You know, how come all of a sudden their epi curves? We're talking about like their curve really looking like completely exceptional. Like no other part of the world, even countries like Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, and South Korea that did a really good job flattening their curves. It looked nothing like what China's did, which is all of a sudden you had this exponential growth, and then you had flatlining like almost immediately with just no in between. You know, I made this joke saying like if you were going to fudge your numbers, always try to make it realistic. Like this is something that we all learned when we were copying, you know, our friends' homework answers, right?
Yeah.
But it's gotten to the point where either they don't care or they're trying to use this as a way to say, look, China is exceptional. We were able to weld people into their apartments and we achieved the impossible. We completely got rid of new cases. You know, this is evidence for the supremacy of the Chinese model. Look at all you messy democracies out there. You know, it's clearly not effective. This is the message they want to drive home to the rest of the world. They may have started it.
And you can, it seems like any kind of narrative, even if it's conspiracy narrative or of kind of this line that doesn't make any sense, because you're right, the math doesn't add up with their curves. But then you add this with the CIA planted this in Wuhan. So maybe does this give at least a plausible story for all of the countries that are allied with them, that are maybe in the Belt and Road Initiative or some of their allies, something to believe? Is that the reason you do this stuff?
Yeah, it's you know, information warfare. It's the art of that. I think Kyle Bass, who I interviewed for COVIDCon, said it best. There were three, actually probably four types of warfare. You have information warfare, you had economic warfare, and digital warfare, and now you have this, and the last step is actual warfare, like military or kinetic warfare, they call it. And so China is engaged in all three now, right? The digital realm with the hacking and AI and all that stuff, and then they're in 5G, and then they're also involved in information warfare. And they're so good at it because they employ so many people in this department, and knowing they're kind of hacking our openness to promote their authoritarianness, and they seem to be very successful in building this narrative. And when I see people here in the West saying like, oh, look at what China's doing, they must be doing something right. This is this is people exactly doing what the Chinese were hoping that.
Okay, and what other ways?
Outcome.
What other ways do you think they hack our openness?
Using economic warfare. So a good example of it would be, for example, what happened with the NBA situation, right? When a citizen of a free country used Twitter to tweet something in support of the Hong Kong pro-democracy protesters, all of a sudden found himself, whipping up this huge storm, and he had to apologize. And he had to apologize because China used its own market as leverage. They knew that the NBA needs access to the Chinese market because it's much larger than the local market, and in fact accounts for most of NBA's, as a league, their growth. But just the threat of pulling their games from streaming, from pulling merchandise, canceling contracts, was enough to get the manager of the Houston Rockets to actually apologize. So this is a very good example of just how they're using economic leverage to control what people in free countries are saying. And it's one thing to control your very own countrymen's words. It's another to be able to have that influence, and your tentacles stretch around the world and stop what people really want to say.
Yeah, it seems like for that one, when they play that card for the first time, I can see sort of why the NBA gets afraid. But at the same time, in any kind of customer, like a customer-client relationship, there's an issue on both sides. Well, the customers can say, well, we won't buy from you anymore. But if you do have a superior product, you're kind of hurting yourself. And what are the Chinese people going to think when Xi Jinping comes back to him and said, well, you can't watch your basketball anymore?
That's exactly it. So at the end of the day, do you think the NBA is superior to the CBA, the Chinese Basketball Association? Of course, the answer is yes. There's no substitute for that. And if you know it, if the NBA had sort of stood their ground and just said, you know what, we're we're going to stand by Daryl Morey, then so what? Let the Chinese people, find out the hard way that their government has essentially, caused them to not be able to watch these amazing games. They might be upset enough to riot.
Yeah, I know that's what I thought too. Is don't immediately, like when you're a salesperson for something and your customer says you need to lower your price, you don't immediately just say yes. You have
Right.
to have the conversation of, okay, why, and let's talk about, that it's a superior product, or if it is, and maybe if you don't want the superior product, you can talk about something else. And it just seemed that it was such a knee-jerk reaction. But as a salesperson, I know how that feels when your customer threatens you and you're like, yikes. So,
But there's a bit of a cultural component. I think there's a bit of deference to culture. Like, these are honor cultures, and the one thing they can't stand is to be disrespected.
that's a good point.
There's a bit of that. That's a bit of that play there, and so they kind of use that. Oh, we're offended. We're offending the Chinese, and therefore they don't want to do business with us.
It's interesting, and that honor culture. But I wanted to hit one more thing before that would be a good segue. But you responded to Jack Posobiec, who we recently did an interview with, and he said that China's soft power is spreading almost as quickly as the virus. And
Yeah.
he said, once confined to South America and Africa through debt trap diplomacy, is now heading to Europe through 5G diplomacy, and the CCP is using the virus as an opportunity to expand their reach. And you kind of mentioned that you retweeted, yes, but that's where America First is limiting too. What did you mean by that?
Well, the problem is that, what China has been doing in the last decade or so, especially, has been this, what he's calling debt trap diplomacy is referring to tactics such as the Belt and Road Initiative, right? It used to be called One Belt, One Road. And that is a long-term infrastructure project that China invests into to promote infrastructure building in various countries around the world. They're trying to sort of recreate. I mean, you remember what the Silk Road was for ancient China. It connected China to Europe and then the rest of the world. And it brought products such as silk, paper, and things that were inventions in China to the rest of the world. And so they're trying to reignite this. And in a way, it's not only it's not just an economic play for China. It's also a soft power play, because by doing something like that, you've invested, say, millions of dollars of say, new highway in Ethiopia. You have some sort of say. Now, I don't think it's a coincidence, obviously, that Ethiopia is part of this, and that Dr. Tedros, the head of the WHO, is also from Ethiopia, and China's invested so much money in this country. The problem is that that they use this as economic leverage. They can say, okay, if you can't pay back these loans, because this is not aid, this is sort of a loan, right? And they can say, all right, you can't pay us back this loan. Here's what you're going to do for us. You're going to allow us to build a military base there because you can't pay us back. Or you're going to allow us to build a port. So now, or you're going to sell us the rights to this port that you control. So in this way, they're able to use that as a lever to get what they want out of these countries. And so when America retreats from the rest of the world, the question is, for me, how then do we expect these third world countries to not just say, you know what, no one else is helping us, and we need to develop. Well, look, the Chinese are the only ones able to do that, so we'll just go with them.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, we need to answer that question, because we cannot expect countries that are, struggling to not find this to be attractive.
Yeah.
And I don't know how to, solve that.
Now, that's a really good point. It was brought up at COVIDCon too that And we're going to get to a super chat in a second. But the fact, like a state like Venezuela, where we don't recognize Maduro and we recognize Juan Guaido as the legitimate ruler, so they're asking for aid, and the last thing we want to do is send 50 million to Venezuela because we're worried it's just going to prop up a dictatorship. How do we know they'll even spend it on their people? But then what are they going to do? They're going to turn to China.
Right. It's the same with Iran as well, right? Because we imposed sanctions. So Iran turned to China, and it's one of those unspoken things. Why was Iran a hotbed of COVID-19 cases? It was very strange. It popped up in Italy, and then it popped up in Iran, and it's because these two countries are part of Belt and Road, which really is Belt and Death at this point.
Wow. And you see why. China needs allies. So the Belt and Road Initiative is really, really good for them to do. They want to get to this.
Yeah, but they're allies in the same way that it's like the mafia, is your ally in giving you security options. Like that's exactly the relationship there.
That's true, but it would seem like the leaders of this country would be aware of it, but the people may not be. Right, so the people of Ethiopia may just feel like, but we've seen China come in and give us goods and services. Right, just like a lot of Africa is Catholic or Christian because they came in and built hospitals, so they adopt the religion.
Actually, it's starting to be the reverse, where it's the elites who are happy about this arrangements with China, and it's the average people now who are saying, "Wait a minute, what's going on?" And partly it's because they're the ones on the front lines, seeing how the Chinese are treating them. I used to go to South Africa a lot, and almost every year, for about 4 or 5 years, somewhere between 2012 to 2016, I was going to South Africa every winter. And during that time, I noticed that people's attitudes there started shifting. So by about 2015, when I was there was a bit of an open hostility towards Asian people, right? And so one day I just asked, I was like, what's going on? I just feel like people are prejudging me a little. And then every time I say, oh, no, I'm from America, they were like, oh, okay, you're fine. Oh, man, those damn Chinese. And so I would ask, okay, what's going on here? And what I found out from them was, you had South Africa started opening to China. There were a lot of Chinese companies that were there, construction, all sorts of companies that were building out infrastructure projects, buildings, real estate. And the difference was that when the Chinese came and they brought their businesses, not only were they treating the locals really badly in terms of labor standards, but they also brought with them businesses, right? Like hotels, restaurants. But instead of opening them up to everybody, they would say oh, we're opening this hotel or restaurant, but only for Chinese people.
Wow. Oh,
and this was happening, by the way, not just in South Africa. It was happening in Egypt. It was happening all over Africa. And so there was this growing realization that these projects were actually very self-serving for the Chinese, but all of the profits were accruing to the 1% of their countries. So their government leaders were signing the contracts, and they were getting all the financial benefits from this deal with China or Chinese companies. But it was not sort of trickling down to the average worker. And so there was growing resentment because they could see that, look, Africa used to be colonized by European powers, but this was just, a new colonizer, and they were not being treated fairly.
Wow. It sounds a little bit reminiscent of some of the Japanese, like World War II, this greater East Asian prosperity sphere, but really it was a whole heck of a lot of Japanese racism against Filipinos and Malaysians and everybody else.
Yeah. No, that's why, see, there's reports now coming out of China, like places like Guangzhou, where McDonald's, Marriott, hotel chains, American companies that are doing business in China are discriminating against Africans.
Yeah, we saw reports of that. And it's crazy. There was a Nigerian official in there trying to explain, and who was just being just listened to, but nearly his arguments were falling on deaf ears because Nigerians are clearly being discriminated against. And he's like, what gives? And they don't have an answer.
But that's why those of us who are either first generation or who grew up in Asia can tell you, are so angry about this concept of intersectionalism, because we know firsthand that all people, and as even people of color, can be racist.
Yeah.
You know, like that's why we reject intersectionalism. It's because of stories like that. Like we grow up with them. They're in our communities. We see firsthand that everyone is capable of racism.
Yeah. We even saw we posted a piece of Chinese artwork where it has different African men compared to animals, like that
Yeah.
almost look like, and this is a bizarre thing that you would almost expect to be some sort of satire,
Right.
from the alt-right or something. But no, this is a legit China gallery. That's wild. Keith Wynn, I want to get to this super chat. He said Wuhan Virus Lab was studying coronavirus bats, and a lab worker was sprayed with bat urine. Lab worker was patient 0. Okay. P.S. I love Melissa and Faisal's work on translating books to fight radicalism.
Oh, thank you.
That's thanks, Keith. Appreciate the super chat. Is that true? It seems like I've heard maybe it was origin in the wet markets. Maybe in fact it was from a virology lab and there was a mistake.
There are quite a few very coincidental, pieces of evidence that are not lining up. Chief of which is that the Wuhan seafood market, on which is being pinned as the source in all of this, doesn't actually sell bats. So, and the second thing was obviously that in 24 hours after the authorities had been notified, they shut the market down permanently. They scrubbed it clean. And it's like one of those things. Let's say there was a crime scene. You want the detectives to go in to spray luminol all over the place, to do their forensics analysis, lift fingerprints, right? But you want them to have access to the crime scene. You wouldn't, if you were guilty, what would you do? You would torch the crime scene. You would try to get rid of it. And that's actually what they did with the actual seafood market. So we're not able to go in and ascertain what the source was. But one of the most incriminating facts is that the very first 2 patients had no connection whatsoever to the market. Like the very first one showed up on 17th November. Yeah. And this individual was a 55-year-old man who had no connection at all to the market. So there's just been a series of strange coincidences. And, it's like conditional probability. Each probability you multiply makes it like increasingly less likely. And so at some point, you have to ask yourself, can we really discredit the lab hypothesis? Not necessarily that this was a bioweapon, but could it have been a lab accident? It was so close to the market. They actually study the bats in question, the bat viruses in question at this particular institute. In fact, people who have been working there themselves, like Dr. Shi herself had said, when I first found out about this, I asked myself, could it have been our lab? That was her first instinct. Of course, she has since retracted. And then now the Chinese government says that any university in China that wants to publish information on the source of this virus now has to go through approval.
Wow.
It's like, are you curious about the truth or not?
I know. It seems like when a lab in Shanghai posted the sequence to the virus, then it was quickly closed down for some kind of for some mysterious reason. So you're right. All information must go to the government, which is crazy. That's just not how science works. I mean, the universities post and publish, and that's how this works.
Plus they expelled a lot of foreign journalists recently. They expelled the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post that have had Beijing bureaus there for a long time. So now we don't have eyes on the ground there. And one of the best ways to get information out of China, because it's such a closed society, was when we had journalists there. Even if it was difficult to get information because the government was so tight-lipped about everything, people at least were willing to talk.
Yeah.
And you could get a general sense of the mood there just by talking to the average Chinese person. And now we've lost that. We don't even have access to that, that outlet anymore.
I can see something brewing around on this. Another piece in COVIDCon that was mentioned was that all Chinese citizens, whether they're at home or abroad or whether they're doing, have, at least are supposed to have or are told to have, a loyalty to the communist government. So that ultimately, it's the God Country Marines or something. The idea is that the CCP should be their highest loyalty, which brings into fact. Well, then what about? Is this going to? Should we look at Chinese businesses that are in America or in Australia or somewhere in the West differently? And could there be an overreaction to that?
Well, I wrote about this in one of my pieces for Spectator. I talked about it. There's this concept in the Arabic world called the Ummah, right? It's like all Muslims in the diaspora have to act as one. And the Chinese Communist Party has essentially created a version of this. I called it the Chinese Ummah, which is there is only one way to be Chinese, and that is to worship and support the Chinese Communist Party. If you're Tibetan, if you are, Falun Gong, if you're Christian, if you're a Uyghur Muslim, you obviously have other loyalties ahead of the state, and therefore you are suspect. If you're from Hong Kong, if you support Hong Kong, if you support Taiwan, you are exiled. In fact, they have basically kidnapped or disappeared people that did not tout the orthodoxy that they've been trying to put out. And this has happened just so many times. People that the recent billionaire Chinese tycoon who spoke out about Xi Jinping's mishandling of the outbreak, he's disappeared.
Mm-hmm.
And this reminds me of these people are like the Salman Rushdies of our time. We need to treat them as watermark cases. Like, this is how far the party is willing to go to just silence its detractors.
Yeah, and I want to know where American feminists are on IFN, who
the doctor.
Gave Wenlang the whistle, and she went on state media and went ahead and just criticized the government's response to this. I mean, she was aware of the human-to-human transmission. She was right on the front lines. Instead of getting a medal, she's missing. And now there was recently a video of her. It's in Chinese, so I don't know what she's saying. But then Radio Free Asia they're somewhat worried that they say, we hope that's her, but it could be coercion. They don't know.
I mean, doesn't this feel like ISIS? These stories of people just disappearing because they didn't conform to their ideology, and then these videos pop up all of a sudden, and they're looking at the camera, or they have to do forced. This is one of their modus operandi. The CCP does a lot of forced confessions. So that's what happened to Dr. Li Wenliang, the very first whistleblower who actually died at age 37. He was first arrested for spreading rumors that there was a disease going around. And then he was forced to sign a confession at the police station. This is classic, tactics of the Communist Party.
It is. And then they turned around, and the central government now is blaming it on the local government, saying, no, we apologize. They apologize to his family. No, he's a hero. And to me, when
the local government did take a fall. They actually had to resign.
Yeah. Okay, but that's easy for this happened in the Soviet Union all the time. The higher ups would just blame the local leaders and send them to the gulags.
Yeah,
exactly. It just also seemed too, and maybe I've got a tinfoil hat on, that he's 37 years old and then he's died of coronavirus. He just doesn't. All of those things. Okay, maybe there is a small chance, but it just seems improbable. And then also one of his colleagues of the 8 where they were all talking to also died. Another ophthalmologist.
Yeah, the ophthalmologists because he was the first one to have sounded the alarm.
I know. It just I don't know. It just.
But there are other comorbidities though. He may have been a smoker. We don't know any of that.
Right. I know. So yeah, a bit of a tinfoil hat, but so I'll let that one go. But IFN being missing, that's wild. Did you hear about the story in the out of Australia? The Sydney Morning Herald had this. An Asian student named Drew Pavlov. This is a while ago, but he was protesting during the Hong Kong when the NBA and the Free Hong Kong thing was going on and all the protests. This university apparently has a lot of ties to the Chinese government, and he was attacked by men in masks. Did you hear about this?
So this happened last year in Australia.
Yes, in Australia. And what happened was so he's been attacked. Now they don't know who it is because it was masked men. However, one of the Chinese consulate general in Australia happens to have a professor named Zhu Ji, who's consul general. He's a professor at the university. Then put out a statement that said this. They described the incidents as a small number of people with ulterior motives carrying out anti-China separatist activities, but also mentioned that patriotic students praised patriotic students for their counter-protests against Chinese separatists. So he never acknowledges that when he talks about the people that beat him up. Now there were some counter-protests, but it's weird that you have somebody celebrating this, calling it patriotism, and it's a weirdity that it's going to drum up suspicions from people in the West.
Right, and that actually this ties into your last question about this. It's going to come up as an issue, I think, because to do any business in China, Chinese companies have to have this backdoor between them and the Communist Party. So you do have to question, right? Like, so if we're going to be doing business with Huawei, it's not like in America where there's this separation. Just like there is a separation between church and state, there is a separation between tech companies and state. We didn't even allow the FBI to get Apple to unlock the phones of the San Bernardino terrorists. But that's not the case in China. All their companies have a backdoor to the government. And so, yes, we have to keep asking ourselves, when we are dealing with Chinese companies here in America, what is the situation? Is there a risk that there is a connection at the back end between the Chinese government and the company? Yeah. We have to ask this question. And the same thing of even academia, right? Like, so there's this thing called the 1,000 Talents program where China pays promising scholars from the West to come to China, set up shop, set up a lab, and they pay them so much money. And here's the thing, like you can choose to make $70,000 as a new PhD. You've been in school for more than 10 years now, so you've had a lot of debt. What are you going to do? Are you going to go work for a fellowship that pays nothing in a U.S. university? Or are you going to join the 1,000 Talents program that's offering a spanking new lab, no FDA regulations, no institutional review board, and just an amazing salary, and just a way to start your career.
Yeah.
So, these are things. So this is where I think this America First stuff does matter, because if we strengthen these, our own institutions at home, why would people look elsewhere?
Yeah, and it sounds a little bit like dealing with China. I'm going to make an Empire Strikes Back reference where, Lando Calrissian makes a deal with the Empire, right? And they change him, and he goes, he's going to take Han Solo, and he goes, that's not part of the deal. And Darth Vader's like, I'm altering the deal. And it seems like that's what China wants to do. Well, they're just going to alter the deal.
Well, and also, once you've kind of like bought into the life that they're giving you, are you going to criticize them, or are you going to kind of become a not shill directly, but unwittingly, right? You're going to try and defend what China has done for you. And so it's very powerful, these programs.
Yeah. Well, that said, obviously Star Trek is superior to Star Wars, but
yes, I fully agree.
Good. I'm glad we agree on the most important things. How do we decouple from China? Is that even possible? I've read things to say, but with 60% of our markets in China, and so much of like the goods in this and that this, if you're going to untangle that mess, holy cow, it's like trying to take dreadlocks and get them into individual hairs.
Well, I think what's come out of this, if there's any silver lining, is the average person's realization that it was a stupid idea to have our global supply chains located inside an adversary, right? A geopolitical rival. There's no reason why, very critical supplies. We're talking about, things like medicines. Why are they located inside of a country which is considered a rival? So it's I think eventually we will be pulling back all these things and asking ourselves, okay, what industries are critical? Trump has called has demarcated the national security innovation base types of industries and companies that are considered critical. If we start to expand that, for example, before we were cutting back on steel because steel is seen as a critical industry. If we went to war all of a sudden and all our steel was located in China, we're totally screwed.
Yeah, and steel's heavily tariffed.
It is.
Yeah.
But heavily tariff is one thing. Can we bring those? Can we actually create and invest in companies here that are creating it, or is it about moving around stuff? Maybe move some things into American ally territory, whether it's India, Vietnam, South Korea, places like that, and then completely bring some industries home.
Yeah. Keith and Chet mentioned Vietnam specifically for that too, and so it does seem like some of that Trump may have been right on his resistance to the TPP then, which lowered tariffs, and specifically you could get around the
Correct.
Steel manufacturing issue.
Correct. He was worried that China would still have influence, through the back door with the other countries in the Pacific.
Yeah.
Which I think was a fair concern.
So Sean in the chat has asked about your mask project and to say happy birthday to Gibbs. Gibbs is happy birthday, Gibbs, the little dog. My favorite picture of him, and you should check Melissa's Twitter, is when you do hazmat chic for dogs. And I don't know where you got this thing. And he's in a face mask and all this stuff. And then at the very end, you're like, he doesn't look very happy.
Yeah, no, my friend had bought a sort of it was actually a plastic raincoat for dogs, but it looks like a hazmat suit because it has a shield.
He's
so
funny.
Actually here. Come, Gibbs. Come here. Gibbs, come. All right, he's here, so I will bring him on. There you go. That's Gibbs.
Hey, Gibbs. Gibbs goes everywhere. At the number of conferences that we've done that Melissa's been to, both MythCons and Minds IRL, we always see Gibbs. So
yeah. Actually, he was at the COVID Con is actually organized by the Human Rights Foundation, which also does Oslo Freedom Forum, and he was there in Oslo for the last Freedom Forum in Norway.
That's good.
So he's a conference dog.
Right. And we don't know many of Gibbs's opinions, but he doesn't like wet markets.
Oh no,
right.
He hates them.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it was weird, the stories of those wet markets that aren't just exotic animals, but stories of torture and like eating baby wolves and all kinds of crazy stuff. And I just didn't know that until all of this came out.
But it's really it's not, there is a cultural component to this. A lot of this is based on traditional Chinese medicine, which is rooted in this old text from the Qing dynasty about how eating certain body parts of animals can increase vitality of certain ailments, right? Like, so for example, if you eat raccoon penis or something, it's good for your boner. I remember, so when I was in elementary school, my mom would give me pig's brain before exams, and I would ask brain in a soup, and I would ask her why, and she would say, oh, if you eat brains, it's good for your brain. So this kind of nonsense, completely zero scientific proof of anything. It's just claims that just make no sense whatsoever.
Wow. I heard that that horny, that term came from rhinoceros horns being used as a male virility tool.
Yeah. No. Okay. I didn't know that's where the term came from. That would be disturbing. but yes, that is true about rhino horns and male virility.
Wow. That's kind of wild. You mentioned you had a post, and I kind of called this almost like a cultural rot, because you said. And this is a tweet. Iraq is not the only Middle Eastern country struggling with the stigma around the virus. Sadly, low-trust societies face the strongest impediments to tackling the crisis, because there were attacks on healthcare workers. I saw this a post by somebody saying, "Don't attack the healthcare workers," and I thought, okay, this can't be America. But what do you mean by a low-trust society? Obviously, you mentioned Iraq, but then later, is China one of those too? But first, maybe tackle Iraq.
In the Middle East in general, there is extremely low trust between the governed and the government. In Iraq's case, I mean, civil society has been completely gutted. And then you have all these different factions which are vying for control. You have the Shias, and the Iranian-backed militias, and then you have the Sunnis and all these tribal powers just in this milieu and trying to gain power. And people just they're very skeptical about what the government says because there hasn't been a strong, you talk about the social contract between people. People expect the government to provide basic things, security, fix the potholes, whatever it is, right? And when you don't receive that end of the bargain, you really start to question, then why do we have a government? And, in cases, in parts of the Middle East where there is strife on a daily basis, civil war, I mean, places like Syria, there's zero trust between the people and the government because the government has shown time and time again that it does not have the people's interests at heart. But you look at the countries. So why is South Korea doing such a good job? Why is Taiwan doing such a good job? Because the people trust their government.
Yeah.
And it matters.
So is China also a low trust society? It seemed like the reason why they're doing social credit is to improve trust. I mean, at least that's their stated goal. It could be, a misdirection.
I mean, for starters, China is completely homogenous, right? Like ethnically.
Yeah.
So there is some level of trust there. The problem is that whatever your discontents are, you can't register them. So if there was low trust, we wouldn't even know because it doesn't register. I mean, see, at least in the Middle East, right, we know there's low trust, but people can say what they want. We can monitor, Telegram, which is the most popular messaging app there. And there isn't governance, so they can't even censor properly. Versus when China censors, they're really good at censoring. They really can do everything with an iron fist. And so we don't even hear about it.
Okay.
But I don't think it's a low trust society, but it's forced on them in a way that they can't even express.
Okay. So, yeah, perhaps maybe the one little bit of legitimately to like what they're trying to do with social credit, it does seem like businesses not paying debts was a big problem. So when they finally opened up to capitalism, there were a lot of people being very bad with it. Opening up, declaring bankruptcy, getting money here, doing that, shifting it around, and really playing a bad game. So to that end, yeah, I think you could just regulate that with laws like we do. But instead,
they've gone overboard with that, because obviously now this has become a way to punish people that the party just disapproves of. Yeah. Oh, you can't get an air ticket now because you haven't been behaving, but that's because they're dissidents. Yeah. So they're not allowing dissidents to get out of the country or go to another place.
Is China should people be afraid? I mean, it's when I see people inside of it, there's a ton of fire videos going around on Twitter where you see these Chinese businesses just in full on flame. And I think that they look like arsons going for insurance money. Is China more of a paper tiger or are they a real tiger?
They're paper in terms of substance, but then they're real tiger in terms of ambitions. And, so one of the things that I sort of came around to especially after doing the homework for the conversation I had with Carl Bass, was that a big part of the Chinese economy is actually built on this house of cards. They've been saying their economy, their GDP is growing at this rate, but it seems like the Communist Party has been inflating a lot of numbers. And a lot of speculators are pretty sure that the Chinese economy is going to pop at some point. But then that's the paper tiger part. The thing is, their ambitions, their military ambitions, are completely not paper. They are tiger, straight out tiger. If you look at the expansionist policies that they've been pursuing in the South China Sea, places that used to be islands that you would go to scuba dive have now become military bases. They've been encroaching into other countries' territories, the Philippines, Singapore's, and then just look at their machinations now on the Taiwanese Strait. So they clearly have political geopolitical and military ambitions. And I don't think that is paper at all. That is very real.
Wow. Yeah. Very interesting. I would recommend that everyone check out COVIDCon. There's not a lot of names that I immediately recognize, but everybody is an expert. I got halfway through the interview with yours. I want to watch the rest. It's really good, and I think a lot of this can settle fears because we have lots of time right now, social distancing, and a lot of angst about what's going on.
Yeah.
So, and a lot of things are going to be changing. And again, everything is a day by day. This will be really interesting to see what's happening. But yeah, I think this is going to dominate the news, and really appreciate you, like, just being voice of reason, being up on this, being smart in this. Also, thanks for the masks. Like your mask project, you're really helping, and we just think you're doing a great job.
I just want to use my platform for to be useful. That's all. That's all I want to do.
That's good. Don't get seduced by Xi Jinping, okay?
No, I won't.
The bukkake reference. We didn't have a bukkake reference.
Well, we could.
Oh, we could. We want to talk about Japan?
Yeah, we could. I could tell a bukkake joke. But very funny. I know Melissa does try to get this in.
I don't know if coronavirus spreads through that way, actually. Probably would. I don't think it's hygienic anymore.
What's that? Oh, you're right. How do you do this? So, have you seen the social distancing sex positions going around? They're hilarious. Yeah.
What are you reading? No, I have not seen that.
Well, it's not so much reading as pictures, but yeah, people are getting creative, and I don't know if they're like photoshopping the Kama Sutra and making sure that like your heads are 6 feet apart.
That's funny. Okay, that's funny.
You can try those out, but it's absurd. I do enjoy some of the humor in all of this. So Melissa's Twitter is also very hilarious. Definitely check it out if you haven't seen it. It's Ms. ML Chen, so MSMEL Chen on Twitter. Awesome to talk to you, and thanks for
you guys are doing amazing work too. So thank you for putting out all this content. Really happy to be a part of it. Really happy to have boosted you guys on Joe Rogan's show too.
Oh, thank you. That was super sweet of you. That was awesome, and you were so fired up that you're like I just loved when you realized you're like, I think I got to take a break now. Like that you're just so self-aware that I want to get there.
Oh no, my heart rate was pounding. I actually did kind of have a panic attack. So.
But like a lot of people might have a bigger panic attack. Well, what do I do now? Can you admit the truth?
Recover it.
And I think
recover it.
Yeah, if China would have just done this and said, "Holy crap, guys, we've got a big virus over here. Can people help us out?"
Right.
They could have actually improved the world.
You know what?
standing.
That's the moral of the story. Don't be afraid of looking bad. Just because, looking bad and the truth, you got to choose the truth. It will come back and bite you if you don't.
It's a really good point. And so in that way, that it was fated to happen. 2 Monster Energy drinks. Check her out on Joe Rogan. It's a really, really good interview. And thanks so much for making time.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.